You thought the modern world was tough? You think you know real fear? Prepare yourselves. We are ripping the emergency brake on the timeline and plunging straight into the pitch-black heart of the 10th century, a time history books politely call the Dark Ages, a moniker that barely scratches the surface of the bone-chilling reality we are about to face. Forget everything you know about comfort. Forget safety. In the year 950 CE, deep within the unforgiving, frost-bitten lands of Saxony, merely surviving until the morning sun managed to crawl above the horizon was an act of brutal, exhausting defiance against the cosmos itself. This was not just a cold winter. This was a geological catastrophe wrapped in a blanket of darkness. A cold so profound it didn't just bite, it consumed the very marrow of your bones, threatening to freeze the life force directly out of the struggling populace. We are standing right now, virtually, outside a tiny, smoke-choked structure, a so-called home. It's timber-framed, mud-daubed, and utterly defenseless against the colossal forces gathering just beyond its flimsy walls, in the relentless, killing darkness. Can you believe that these structures, barely more sophisticated than a stacked bonfire, and often sharing space with the livestock, were the only barrier standing between humanity and absolute oblivion in the German heartland? They were prisons built of necessity. The roof was thatched straw, a flammable beacon for disaster, and the windows? Non-existent, or covered by thin, oiled animal skins, letting in just enough sickly, pale light to confirm you hadn't yet died from the constant inhalation of acrid wood smoke. Inside, the air was thick, suffocating, a miserable mixture of the smoke, the stale odors of unwashed bodies, and the lingering, metallic scent of desperation. This was life in the violent, demanding cradle of the German Empire. But the cold, terrifying as it was only half the nightmare that plagued every living moment. There was a constant, gnawing terror that no one ever dared to speak of aloud in the light. The truly monstrous things that waited in the ancient, unmapped forests. The shadows that were drawn like moths to the faint, flickering hope of a struggling hearth fire. We're talking about more than just the desperate, starving wolves, although the packs were certainly larger and hungrier than anything recorded today. We are talking about the relentless iron grip of fear brought on by the encroaching human world. We speak of the Magyars, whose raiding parties were legendary for their speed and cruelty. The Slavic tribes, pushed back but never truly broken. The ambitious local warlords, and the sheer, unpredictable violence of the entire feudal tapestry unraveling just outside the door. Imagine trying to sleep, pressed shoulder to shoulder with your family for warmth, knowing that any unexpected sound, a snap of a twig, a distant, muffled shout, could signal a catastrophe no one saw coming. An end so swift and brutal, it would wipe your entire lineage from the records. Meet Alaric. He is not a king. He is a farmer, a warrior, and a father, constantly calculating the odds against his meager survival supplies. His face is perpetually etched with the worry lines of a man who knows he is one bad harvest, one disastrous raid, or one unexpected blizzard away from losing absolutely everything he has fought and bled for. Tonight, the wind howled a tune he hated, a piercing, high-pitched scream that sounded less like mere weather and more like a warning siren cutting through the deep, penetrating silence of the Saxon night. He felt it in his gut, that ancient primal knowledge that something was fundamentally wrong. The temperature was dropping too fast, accelerating beyond the expected seasonal severity. The smoke from the central fire, usually reliable for warmth, seemed reluctant to rise, clinging low to the floor. The floor beneath his worn, leather-bound feet was packed earth, cold enough to draw the heat straight out of his very soul. Yet he dared not stay too close to the fire. The fire was life, yes, but it was also a reckless, dangerous beacon in a world designed specifically to extinguish every fragile source of light. He clutched the rough-hewn handle of his great axe, the weight familiar, comforting, yet utterly inadequate against the terrifying scale of the threats he faced daily. Every breath he took was monitored, shallow. His wife, Ilara, slept fitfully beside the 3 children, bundled tight in scratchy wool and rough hides, their collective survival entirely dependent on the flawless vigilance of this one man. This was the brutal contract of 10th century existence, perpetual, exhausting readiness. No holidays, no moments of true peace, just the endless, grinding marathon of staying alive until spring returned, if it ever decided to return at all. But tonight, the air itself felt heavy, weighted down by an unseen pressure. It was the kind of night where legendary heroes were forged, or where families were simply erased from the historical record, leaving behind nothing but cold ashes and unanswered questions, swallowed by the forest. The worst part about these cold nights inside the timber-framed homes wasn't the physical discomfort, the smoke inhalation, or the constant threat of fire that could consume their entire existence in minutes. No, the worst part was the profound, suffocating lack of sound. When the forest went silent, truly silent, it meant that something massive, something terrifying, was moving through the underbrush, scattering the lesser beasts and causing even the nocturnal owls to hold their breath in terror. That silence was the real killer. Alaric's eyes, hardened by years of watching the horizon for trouble, were fixed relentlessly on the door. A single, heavy slab of crude oak, bolted crudely with iron fittings, scavenged from some forgotten Roman ruin miles away. That door was their final, last line of defense. He mentally ran through the inventory. 3 days of dried venison, a dwindling supply of stored rye, and enough firewood to maybe last another week if they rationed with brutal ruthlessness. Survival was a ledger book written in scarcity and blood. Every creak of the ancient timbers above him sounded like a gigantic, slow footstep outside. Every shift in the straw bedding sounded like an intruder drawing a weapon inside the room. His nerves were stretched tighter than a bowstring on a winter hunt. Can you fathom that level of sustained paranoia? The kind of stress that fundamentally alters your DNA. This wasn't just anxiety. This was a necessary survival mechanism, honed over generations of relentless, brutal necessity. Then it happened. Not a quick snap, not a distant howl, but a distinct, deliberate thump against the outside wall, followed by a slow, heavy scraping sound that sent a jolt of pure, freezing, adrenalized terror straight through Alaric's spine. It was too heavy for a wolf, too methodical, too intelligent for a simple tree branch falling in the wind. This was deliberate, calculated movement. Something was testing the structural integrity of their sanctuary, probing for weakness. The temperature inside the small home seemed to plummet instantly, despite the blazing heart of the fire. The children stirred, sensing the sudden, palpable shift in their father's demeanor, their small hands clutching the rough blankets tighter. Alaric didn't move a muscle. He simply lowered his head, his focus absolute, his grip on the axe tightening, until his knuckles turned bone white in the dim, smoky light. He needed to know what was out there before he committed to violence and exposed his family. Was it a scouting party of desperate Slavic raiders looking to grab livestock and burn the settlement for sport? Or was it something far older, far more elemental, something dredged up from the forgotten pagan past that still clung fiercely to the shadowy corners of the world and hated the Christian cross? He waited, breath held, the silence amplifying the frantic, rhythmic pulsing of his own heart in his ears. The moment stretched, agonizing, elastic, threatening to snap under the unbearable tension. Then the sound came again, this time lower, right near the base of the wall, a distinct, guttural hiss. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was a promise of absolute destruction, whispered in the terrible language of the grave. Alaric knew with chilling certainty that whatever had found their little timber home in the desolate cold of Saxony was not looking for warmth or shelter. It was looking for a sacrifice. And this, my friends, was only the terrifying, pulse-pounding beginning of a night that would redefine terror in the 10th century. Get ready, because the walls of this fragile Saxon home are about to shatter, revealing a history far darker and bloodier than you ever imagined possible. The sound didn't just scratch at the rough-hewn timbers. It tore through the fragile veil of sleep, a sickening, grinding noise that spoke of intent, not just wind. Alaric's eyes snapped open in the absolute, crushing blackness of the Saxon night, instantly fighting the overwhelming urge to cough on the heavy, stale smoke that hung perpetually beneath the thatch. This wasn't the familiar, comforting howl of the blizzard ripping across the frozen Elbe plains, nor was it the settling groan of the ancient oak frame shrinking against the ruthless, deep cold. This was something intelligent, something heavy, testing the weakest point of his entire world, the single smoke-cured door, bolted with a flimsy iron bar that was more suggestion than barrier against true malice. He lay perfectly still on the rough straw mattress, every muscle coiled, the frigid air tasting like metal in his lungs as his breath hitched. The immense effort required just to stay warm had been an all-day battle, a battle now completely forgotten in the face of sudden, immediate terror. The small central fire pit, the Feuerstelle, had dwindled hours ago, leaving only a meager, dying bed of embers that offered no practical warmth and even less light. The air inside the single-room Wohnhaus was barely above freezing, a freezing fog that condensed on the inner surface of the roof and occasionally dripped onto the bedding. This chilling interior temperature was a testament to the brutal inefficiency of their engineering. The timber-framed Stenderbau was designed for quick construction and defense against rain, not against the soul-crushing depths of a 10th century Saxon winter. The true smell of survival in 950 CE was the stench of damp earth, stale smoke clinging to the thatch roof, and the heavy, sour musk of the livestock sleeping securely beneath the same roof, separated only by a low, porous wicker screen. Another scrape. This time it was lower, closer to the frozen dirt foundation. It sounded like a heavy tool being used deliberately. Perhaps the sharp, curved edge of a battle axe, or a specialized splitting wedge, catching on the fieldstones Alaric had dragged in to buttress the lower wall. It was methodical. It was patient. And that patience was far more frightening than a frantic, panicked assault. It meant the intruder was confident, perhaps even experienced in the art of breaking into freezing, isolated homes. Hilda, his wife, shifted slightly beside him, her breath catching in a shallow, terrified gasp that she immediately smothered with her sleeve. They communicated without words, the universal language of 10th century fear, utter silence, and accelerated heartbeats pounding in the collective darkness. To move, to make any sound at all, was to confirm their presence, to invite the unknown terror to finish its inspection and begin the final, lethal breach. This was not the time for courageous action. This was the moment for primal, animalistic concealment, hoping the darkness would swallow them whole. He knew the layout of this fragile trap intimately. The walls were nothing more than wattle and daub, mud and straw smeared over woven hazel branches, constantly shrinking, perpetually failing against the humidity and the extreme temperature shifts. If you pushed hard enough, especially after weeks of freezing, the outside could simply become the inside without much resistance. He remembered his father joking that the house was merely a suggestion of shelter, a thin disguise against the wilderness. The immense weight of the massive, single-pitched roof, heavy with straw and moss, was supposed to hold everything down and provide thermal mass, but tonight it felt like a crushing weight, ready to collapse under the pressure of the unseen menace outside. Saxony, under the expanding power of Otto the Great, was a land of constant, grinding warfare and lawlessness. While the massive armies fought the Magyars in the south and solidified the grip on the Slavic lands to the east, the domestic borders were porous, bleeding danger in the form of desperate men. Were these Lutetian raiders, driven across the Elbe by starvation and the fear of German colonization? Or worse, were they rogue Norsemen, far from their longships, operating as opportunistic predators, hunting isolated settlements for easy winter plunder? The sheer isolation of their homestead, miles from the nearest fortified burg, or even the meager protection of the local duke's estate, meant that any help would arrive only after the massacre was complete, and the home was nothing but smoldering ruin. The cold was their persistent, everyday enemy, extracting labor and warmth, but the men who stalked the forests were the executioners who took everything else. Alaric slowly, painstakingly reached under the straw bedding, his hand seeking the familiar, rough, whalebone handle of his sax, the short, heavy, single-edged fighting knife that was the only law left when the sun went down. The heavy weight of the crude iron felt like an anchor in the storm of his fear, a cold comfort. He pressed his knuckles white, drawing a tiny, fragile measure of resolve from the cold steel, and the knowledge that he was armed, however meagerly, against the odds. Suddenly, the tentative scraping stopped. The silence that followed was not relief. It was a vast, echoing vacuum, the kind of absolute stillness that precedes the sound of shattering violence, a dreadful preparation. Alaric strained his ears, focusing past the roaring blood in his temples and the frantic pulse of the nearby goats housed 20 feet away. He realized the sound was now coming from above and slightly off-center. Something was moving across the rough roof thatch. It wasn't the light footfall of a fox or a weasel hunting rats. This was deliberate, heavy movement, shifting the ancient timbers and dislodging frozen clumps of sod and snow that rained down with soft thuds onto the dirt floor inside. Whoever or whatever was up there was actively looking for a breach, a weak point in the highly flammable roof structure, where they could drop straight into the sleeping area, maximizing the element of shock and terror, forcing compliance through fear. The Saxon home, designed primarily to keep the rain out and the livestock sheltered, was also a perfect funnel for an attacker. One way in, nowhere to run, and the only light source easily controlled by the invaders. He could dimly see the faint, almost imperceptible shadow of the roof timbers through the thin ceiling. And then he saw it. A small, splintered crack in the main crossbeam, visible only because the ambient starlight, faint as a ghost, was pouring through a significant chink in the eaves. And then that cold pinprick of light was suddenly, violently blocked. Something massive, something utterly opaque, was pressing against the wood and the thin layer of daub that separated them from the icy night. A sound of tremendous effort followed, a deep, guttural grunt that was definitely human, definitely male, and definitely filled with murderous malice, vibrating through the entire timber structure. He heard the sickening snap of woven wicker as the daub was pulled away from the frame near the roofline. The structural integrity of their sanctuary was being dismantled, piece by desperate piece, the very essence of their security vanishing into the night air. Alaric knew he had mere seconds. If the attacker dropped in, they would land right on top of Hilda and the sleeping children. The knife was ready, but he couldn't fight an armored man in the pitch black without guaranteeing injury to his family. He had to draw the threat away, or better yet, make them hesitate. Inject a crucial moment of doubt into the assault plan. He had to remind the monster outside that this flimsy wall held not just soft, defenseless targets, but a defender who was ready to bleed the frozen earth dry. With a controlled burst of energy, Alaric ripped the heavy woolen blanket off his body, simultaneously rising to a low crouch, the sacks held low and reversed, ready for the upward thrust. He whispered a silent, desperate prayer to Wodan, the ancient war god they still secretly revered, despite the local bishop's stern, terrifying warnings about hellfire, and prepared to meet the terror head-on. The air above the crack shifted again, and a dark, massive silhouette began to descend, an inhuman shadow framed against the cruel, indifferent Saxon stars. The invasion had begun. The timber walls were failing, and the true, brutal history of this land was about to be written in fire and blood on this cold, miserable floor. The sound that had ripped Alaric from his meager sleep was not the usual groan of settling wood, nor the howl of the bitter north wind, but the sharp, sickening crack of structural failure. A sudden, lethal draft of air that felt less like cold and more like physical, razor-edged ice slammed into the interior of the hut, instantly extinguishing the already dying ember light on the hearth. The darkness that followed was not just the absence of light, but a thick, oppressive blanket of absolute terror, amplifying the pounding of his own frantic blood. He scrambled backward on the dirt floor, his heart hammering against his ribs like a desperate drummer signaling retreat, his bare feet agonizingly cold against the frozen earth. He knew the difference between the sounds of a house surviving and a house dying. The enemy wasn't outside. The enemy was already in the architecture, testing the very limits of the wattle and daub infill and the load-bearing timber posts.
This fragile shelter, built only of rough-hewn oak posts sunk directly into the cold, damp earth, a terrifyingly vulnerable Pfostenbau design, was never meant to withstand a calculated assault. It was built merely to defy the wind and the snow, not the organized, desperate will of armed men.
Through the widening gap where a section of the woven hazel hurdles and clay daub had fractured near the corner coast, Alaric could see them. They were silhouettes against the impossible, sterile white reflection of the Saxon winter moon. Massive, hulking shapes that moved with terrifying, practiced silence. They were not wolves. Wolves didn't wield axes that reflected the light with such chilling efficiency, nor did they move with such methodical intent. These were raiders, likely Magyars pushed west by starvation and the harshness of the Carpathian winter, or perhaps even rival German factions. Men who saw a single isolated timber farmstead, not as a home, but as a potential cache of grain, iron, and enslaved bodies, ready for the taking.
His wife, Ilara, instantly suppressed the cry building in her throat, pulling the two youngest children tighter against her, burying them deep beneath the scratchy wool and animal hides. Survival in this era demanded absolute, instantaneous silence in the face of death, a desperate attempt to become invisible in the shadows.
Alaric reached for his only reliable defense, not a sword which only the elite could afford, but a heavy, utilitarian felling axe, its edge maintained by brutal, constant necessity. This single shared space, the living area, the kitchen, the sleeping chamber, the small stofa where the few animals were kept for their warmth, was now an exposed death trap. Every movement, every frantic breath echoed off the raw timber beams. The invaders were methodically widening the breach, tearing away the very definition of their sanctuary, treating the walls like paper. The strategic geopolitical terror of 950 CE was this. While Otto I, the mighty king of the Germans, obsessed over unifying the duchies and conquering Lombardy, the true, bloody work of empire was happening here, on the fringes. This farm was the literal, vulnerable edge of the emerging Ottonian realm, a boundary marked not by sturdy stone fortifications, but by the pathetic resilience of mud and sticks. The raiders knew this architecture intimately. They knew where the posts were weakest, where the daub had shrunk from the frame after a few too many seasons of contraction and expansion. They were exploiting the inherent structural failure built into every single settlement, trying to claw a living from the harsh, contested ground of Saxony. Alaric braced himself, the axe handle slick with cold sweat, knowing that if they breached the main timber frame, the small fire he had just nursed back to life would become the beacon drawing his executioners closer to the inevitable slaughter. With a final, agonizing shriek of splitting oak and snapping bindings, the section of the wall gave way entirely, collapsing inward in a shower of dry clay dust and shattered wood. The brutal reality of the night flooded in, the frigid air, the heavy scent of unwashed horse, and the massive cloaked figures filling the sudden void.
There were at least 5 of them, their faces masked by shadow and grime, but their intent screaming louder than any battle cry. Their first move was not to loot, but to secure the destruction. One of them, a giant bearing the distinct curved saber of a Magyar mercenary, swung a massive burning torch, not to light the way, but to ignite the highly flammable thatched roof above. The terror was now absolute. The flimsy trap had been sprung. The flammable structure that was meant to protect them was now actively becoming the means of their incineration. Alaric roared, a sound torn from the deepest well of primal fury, and surged forward, swinging the felling axe in a wide, desperate arc. He wasn't aiming for a kill. He was aiming for the torch, the epicenter of their doom, the single point of entry for the true terror of the 10th century. The blow glanced off the Magyar's leather-armored shoulder, but knocked the burning bundle of reeds flying, sending a shower of sparks across the dry straw bedding on the floor. The fight devolved instantly into a terrifying close-quarter scrum, illuminated only by the frantic dance of the scattered embers that threatened to catch the dry thatch immediately. The cold outside was a weapon, freezing the sweat on his brow, but the heat inside was now a greater threat, spreading rapidly through the dry, decade-old timber. This was the terrifying calculus of 10th century Saxon life. Death lurked not just in the hands of the enemy, but in the very design of your home. He parried a heavy shield, the impact jarring his teeth, and realized with sickening clarity that these men had not come for a quick raid. They had come to purge the settlement, to leave nothing behind but ashes and a horrific warning, ensuring that this cold, miserable corner of the world remained untamed, un-Saxon, and forever under the dominion of chaos. The air grew thick with smoke, and Alaric knew, with chilling certainty, that he was fighting not against 5 men, but against the combined destructive forces of history itself, demanding his immediate extinction. The world dissolved into the high-pitched, splintering scream of dry oak. The axe, wielded with desperate animal strength, did not merely strike the door. It tore the very fabric of the house's defense, plunging the already suffocating interior into an instant maelstrom of freezing air and violent intent. Alaric did not hesitate. He had spent 20 years navigating this unforgiving wilderness of the Carolingian remnants, and hesitation was the shortest, most direct path to the unmarked grave beneath the unforgiving loam. The smoke, thick and punitive from the poorly vented hearth, saved him. It was a blinding, chemical shield, forcing the attackers to choke and pause right in the breached threshold,
where the temperature differential, the brutal shock of the external cold meeting the struggling interior heat, was enough to steal the breath from their lungs and cloud their vision. He drove the fire poker, a long, heavy length of rough-forged iron, low and hard, not aiming for a killing blow, which would be impossible in this chaos, but for disabling impact, shattering the fragile integrity of the knee of the first silhouette to stagger past the frame, dropping him instantly with a sickening, wet crack. This wasn't some mighty stone keep of the rising Ottomans. This was a Saxon wohnhaus, a temporary, agricultural shelter against eternal chaos, designed to last perhaps a generation before being deliberately disassembled or falling to rot. Its walls were nothing but interwoven hazel branches plastered with mud and dung, wattle and daub, a construction method unchanged for 1,000 years, now brittle as glass in the deep frost. Every impact resonated through the entire frame, a terrifying structural symphony, signaling imminent, catastrophic collapse. These timber homes were engineered for speed of construction and resource efficiency, not siege defense. The Pfosten, the main support posts, were merely driven into the ground, not set in stone foundations, making the entire structure susceptible to being rocked and toppled by concerted effort. They were organized. 5 men, yes, but not common bandits stumbling drunkenly in the dark. These moved with the grim, professional efficiency of men who had seen war, men who understood precisely how quickly a life could be extinguished between the Elbe and the Weser, between the tenuous authority of the emerging German kings and the endless, predatory hunger of the Slavs to the east. The leader, a massive shadow framed by the icy moonlight pouring through the shattered door, carried a short spear, its iron tip glistening with frost and the promise of quick, surgical death. Alaric retreated slightly, drawing them deeper into the dense, heated atmosphere of his home, where his eyes, accustomed to the dim glow of the sputtering oil lamp, held a slight temporary tactical advantage over the men struggling to adjust from the perfect blackness outside. He spun, grabbing a coil of rope used for trussing game, and lunged toward the central roof support post, the massive, load-bearing stender. If they were smart enough to bring that down, the entire heavy weight of the massive thatched roof, 3 tons of frozen straw, waterlogged timber, and packed snow, would crush them all indiscriminately, ensuring silent, swift extinction for everyone inside. The sound of the battle was horrifyingly intimate, amplified by the thin walls, the wet thud of wood on flesh, the ragged, painful gasps of men fighting for air in the smoke, the low, terrifying moan of the timber framing as the entire house twisted and warped under the violence. Somewhere in the back, behind the thin wattle and daub partition separating the living space from the communal storage area where the winter stores were kept, his wife, Ilara, held their children silent, their fate hanging precariously on the next swing of Alaric's improvised iron weapon. This wasn't merely a fight for gold or livestock. This was the primal struggle for the continued existence of his bloodline against a world that perpetually, systematically, sought to prune the weak and reclaim the land for the wild. The attackers were now trying a new, dangerous tactic. They were probing the exterior walls, searching for the weakest points in the brittle mud and stick cladding. Realizing the main doorway was a fatal bottleneck Alaric controlled. The massive, thick, heavy thatch roof, usually the symbol of shelter and security against the endless rain, now became the ultimate threat. That 3-foot layer of frozen straw wasn't just rudimentary insulation. It was a perfect combustible fire hazard, a haven for rats, and, crucially, a dense weight of material ready to avalanche down if the structural purlins faltered. Outside, the temperature was plunging toward an unforgiving, lethal 0 degrees Celsius, capable of killing a healthy, exposed man in mere hours if he stood still or suffered blood loss. The few seconds the door had been ripped open had flooded the room with air so sharp it felt like shattered glass slicing the lungs, immediately stealing the precious stored heat Alaric and his family had banked through hours of effort. The men fighting were battling not just Alaric, but the raw, brutal, elemental power of the Saxon winter, a silent, ceaseless killer that always claimed the ultimate victor's spoils, regardless of the outcome of the human conflict. Alaric saw his chance, a desperate move fueled by adrenaline and the sheer will to survive. The hearth fire, usually a source of passive comfort, was now a chaotic, spitting, dynamic beast in the center of the room. He kicked over a heavy wooden bucket of water near the fire pit, sending a massive cloud of hissing, superheated steam and choking ash directly into the faces of the 2 men nearest the center post who were trying to flank him. They shrieked, blinded for an agonizing momentary second as the steam seared their already cold skin. He didn't wait for them to recover. He lunged immediately, driving the sharp, crude end of the iron poker not at the heavily protected head, but through the attacker's heavy wool tunic and into the soft, unprotected, yielding flank, twisting the metal with a brutal, satisfying crunch that signaled internal bone had given way. 1 down, 4 remaining, now staggering backward, realizing with dawning cold terror, historical animal. The first man Alaric struck, the one with the shattered knee, was crawling away, dragging his limp, useless leg through the muddy floor, his whimpers swallowed instantly by the roaring wind now screaming through the gaping, jagged hole in the doorway. The house was grievously wounded, bleeding cold air and smoke, its structural integrity fatally compromised, every wooden joint screaming in protest. Alaric stood over the dying man, his chest heaving, his vision blurring from the smoke and exertion, listening intently to the crunch of frost under the boots of the 3 remaining, dark shadows retreating back into the overwhelming, lethal blackness outside. They were gone for now, but the battle was emphatically not over. They had merely retreated to reassess the vulnerability of the shattered timber frame, preparing for the true, sustained assault that the brutal historical necessity of survival demanded. This treacherous, frigid night was far from finish.
Alaric jammed the rough-hewn oak wedge into the gaping maw where the clay infill had disintegrated, his breath fogging the sliver of moonlight that pierced the breach. Every muscle screamed against the paralyzing cold, a cold that wasn't just temperature, but a physical, crushing weight designed by the devil himself to extinguish the struggling Saxon flame of life. He knew this patch was temporary, a pathetic truce negotiated with the merciless northern winter.
The timber frame, often lauded as the great Germanic innovation, the fockwork that defied stone, was revealing its fatal flaw under this sustained, brutal assault. The very joints, pegged with tree nails and designed to flex slightly, were now groaning like dying beasts, contracting violently as the temperature plummeted toward the historical threshold of certain exposure death, the true killer in 10th century Saxony.
He could hear the low, terrified whimpering of Alara and the children huddled by the central hearth, their fear a palpable entity thicker than the acrid smoke clinging to the heavily thatched roof. The fire, their only true ally, was a greedy monster demanding constant wood, its momentary warmth receding instantly into the vast, hungry darkness pressing in on the fragile structure, amplifying the terror of their domestic imprisonment.
The failure wasn't just the impact, it was the structural betrayal of the infill itself. The mixture of straw, dung, and clay, the very guts of the house, had absorbed the internal moisture from their breath and cooking, only to have that moisture flash freeze in the extreme sub-zero air, exploding the weak bonds of the wattle and daub like 1,000 tiny internal bombs going off in slow, agonizing succession.
This wasn't just a draft. It was a portal to the endless, icy void of the 10th century European wilderness, a catastrophic failure of engineering, magnified by the environmental hostility of the era. Alaric scraped the back of his hand across the splintered surface of the main sill beam, feeling the agonizing vibration of the whole house shuddering against a force that remained stubbornly unseen, yet profoundly felt. Was it the legendary Lupus gigas, the massive wolf pack driven mad by famine and desperate hunger, seeking the warmth and flesh within? Or was it worse, the stealthy, organized cruelty of the Slavic raiders, rumored to be prowling the Elbe frontier, pushed westward by their own desperate need for grain, gold, and most terrifyingly, captives to sell into the burgeoning slave markets of the East? The stillness that followed the initial crash was the most terrifying sound of all. The deep, historical silence of a world where silence meant lethal predation was stalking its prey, calculating the next, more precise move. He pressed his ear against the cold, rough grain of the oak post, straining to detect the unmistakable crunch of snow under a heavy boot, the sound that signified organized human intent, a threat far more chilling than any animal. His mind raced, calculating the odds of survival based on the very construction of his home. The house, built intentionally close to the earth to conserve the minimal heat rising from the ground, meant any predator or raider was already right upon them, right at the foundational level. There was no perimeter, no defensible space beyond this single, flimsy layer of wood and dirt, making every corner a potential vulnerability. He recalled the warnings from the local graph during the last levy. The geopolitical instability had reached a fever pitch. Emperor Otto was far to the south, dealing with Italian intrigues and papal politics, leaving the Saxon heartland frighteningly exposed to the shifting, mercenary allegiances of the pagan tribal federations and disgruntled nobility to the east. Alaric gripped the heavy iron poker, its cold handle stinging his palm, the only weapon truly capable of puncturing the thick hides of beasts or the heavy leather armor of a determined man. He peered through the tiny, high window, a mere slit of oiled animal bladder meant to let in light, not provide defense, and saw nothing but swirling snow and the black, impenetrable silhouette of the surrounding forest, which seemed to swallow the house whole. He had to make a choice instantly: retreat to the secure stuba, the small, inner, warmest room usually reserved for sleeping, near the back wall, or stand his ground and defend the breach in the main hall. Retreat meant abandoning the meager stores, their food security, and compromising the structural integrity of the larger space, a concession to the cold that would rapidly drain their remaining life force over the long night.
He chose the fight, fueled by the desperate, primal instinct of a father protecting his bloodline. He moved with a practiced, desperate urgency, dragging the heavy, smoke-blackened storage chest filled with salted meats, dried grain, and precious dried herbs to buttress the weakened section of the wall. This chest was their survival, now suddenly their shield against the unseen enemy. An act of sheer, terrifying commitment.
As he shoved the chest, his foot slipped on something slick and utterly unexpected. Not ice, but a thick, dark viscosity on the earth floor, slowly seeping inward from the breach he had just temporarily sealed. It was blood, thick and rapidly cooling in the brutal air.
Not his own. A chilling, agonizing realization snapped through the paralyzing fear. Whatever had struck the wall had been injured, driven off by the initial noise, or perhaps by the frantic shouting and the brief appearance of a light source. But it was still out there, bleeding, lurking, desperate, and certainly not alone.
The metallic, earthy scent of fresh blood filled the freezing air, a primal alarm bell ringing the doom of the night across the exposed land. This was not a wild beast merely stumbling through the dark. This was a calculated, painful retreat by a thinking adversary. The enemy knew they were inside, and the enemy was wounded and potentially enraged by the injury.
Alaric felt a surge of terrifying clarity mixed with pure adrenaline. The initial assault was merely reconnaissance, a probing attack to test the limits of the human resilience inside. The predator, human or animal, it mattered little now, was regrouping in the shadows, waiting for the cold to do its slow, corrosive work, waiting for the fire to dwindle to embers, waiting for the inevitable moment when the human resolve inside the fragile timber cage
finally cracked and splintered like the wood. He raised the poker, its tip catching the flickering light, his shadow dancing wildly on the rough walls, knowing with absolute certainty that the next sound he heard would not be a mere crash, but the true, organized, sustained catastrophe they had been dreading since the sun sank beneath the frostbitten horizon. The house was wounded. The enemy was wounded. The deadly, inevitable endgame of this dark Saxon night had begun, and only one side would see the fragile light of dawn. The air pressure inside the wattle and daub cage shifted violently, sucking the precious, smoky heat outward like a dying breath. Alaric's lungs seized on the sudden influx of the exterior frost, sharp enough to draw blood. The enemy was retreating, yes, but its movement was not stealthy. It was a horrid, grinding sound, the sound of heavy weight dragging across frozen earth, punctuated by wet, guttural gasps that echoed the desperation of a cornered predator. He scrambled toward the breach, not daring to look away from the hole ripped into the fabric of their shelter, a gap where 3 layers of meticulously applied clay and straw had just minutes ago promised relative safety. Now the wind howled through the exposed timber frame, singing a high-pitched, deadly song of inevitable collapse. In this brutal, unforgiving sanctuary, the house was not just 4 walls, it was the entire universe, the sole defense against the twin evils of the outside world, the rapacious human raider and the merciless killing cold. To lose the structure meant instant exposure, guaranteed death by hypothermia, long before any blade could find its mark. Alaric pressed his face against the intact section of the wall, peering through the smallest crack, using the minimal light cast by the nearly extinguished central hearth. He saw it. A monstrous, elongated shadow limping toward the meager boundary of their fenced enclosure. The Hozaun. The shadow was dragging something heavy, something that glinted faintly even in the near absolute blackness. The terror was compounded by a sickening thought. The enemy was not just injured, it was potentially retrieving a weapon, or perhaps dragging the heavy iron tool it had used to initially test the structural integrity of the home. Iron was rare. A single axe head or spear point was worth a year's wages to a common peasant, and its mere presence here signified a threat far beyond a common bandit seeking simple sustenance. Behind him, Elara, his wife, remained silent, a monument of forced stillness, holding their 2 youngest children pressed against her tunic, their tiny breaths catching like failing mechanisms in the dark. Their eldest son, 7-year-old Theron, clutched a heavy wooden club, a farm implement, useless against true armor, yet held with the defiance of a future warrior. Alaric knew he had mere moments before the wound in the wall rendered the entire house uninhabitable, allowing the killing chill to fully invade and paralyze them all. He commanded Elara to move the massive, heavy oak chest, their most prized possession, holding their winter stores of dried meat and grain, and push it against the shattered frame. The chest groaned against the pressure, but it was a temporary fix, delaying the inevitable collapse of the load-bearing post the enemy had targeted with such vicious accuracy.
He needed straw, layers of it, packed thick and damp, to temporarily patch the breach and insulate them against the sub-zero air currently rushing past his ears. The cold was a physical assailant, draining their strength and thickening their blood, a more reliable killer than any human assailant.
The scent of pine and old ash mixed sickeningly with the metallic, pungent smell of blood, human blood, unmistakable and heavy in the frigid air. Alaric realized the horrific calculus of their situation. The attacker had bled significantly, meaning it was desperate, wounded, and yet it had not fled entirely.
It was calculating, moving with terrifying patience. This was not a quick raid intended for looting. This was personal, strategic, and deeply malevolent. Only a warrior, hardened by countless battles and driven by a need far greater than mere silver, would risk a wound this grievous simply to maintain position outside a peasant's hovel.
Was it a Slav raider pushed west by famine and the ever-shifting borders of the nascent Ottonian Empire, its brutal discipline demanding success or death? Or perhaps a banished Saxon, a man stripped of his weregild, man price, and driven to act outside the rigid legal codes of the age, seeking vengeance or absolute survival in the wild beyond the reach of the comitatus?
The identity didn't matter now. Only its capability for murder did. Alaric silently moved toward the iron pot, simmering perpetually over the hearth, reserved for keeping the tallow soft and ready. He scooped a quantity of the thick, rendered animal fat mixed with pine resin onto a tightly bound bundle of dried flax. He was preparing the oldest, most terrifying weapon known to man in a timber-framed world: fire projectile. To use fire inside the structure was madness. One spark could consume the entire home in minutes, turning their sanctuary into a blazing funeral pyre. Yet he had no choice. The risk of fire was terrifyingly real in 10th century construction, where the beams were stacked dry and the roof was often thatched with highly flammable reeds or straw, waiting only for an ember to consume everything they owned. But fire offered light, and light was their only weapon against the shadow that waited just beyond the perimeter. The small, deep-set window slits, the Lichtloch, were too small to afford a firing position, forcing him to risk the main door or the breach itself. He chose the door, the only structure reinforced enough to withstand a momentary assault. He carefully poured a thin stream of lamp oil onto the floor near the entrance, a medieval tripwire designed not to kill, but to momentarily blind and disorient the moment the door was thrown open. A final, desperate gamble, predicated on the enemy being foolish enough to charge headlong into the trap. Then the dragging sound ceased entirely. The wet gasps were gone. An absolute, crushing silence descended upon the frost-encrusted fields of Saxony. broken only by the frantic drumming of Alaric's own heart, amplified by the heavy stillness of the night.
It was the silence of the hunter who has successfully concealed itself, the moment of deadliest tension before the final explosive move. The cold intensified sharply, pulling the last vestiges of warmth from the interior. The exposed wood near the wall breach began to groan under the strain, contracting violently.
Alaric knew the enemy was close, likely pressed against the wall itself, listening, smelling the fear and the heat escaping the damaged frame. He raised the flax bundle, now saturated and ready to be lit by the last glowing ember. He looked at Alara one last time, a silent promise and a silent farewell passing between them. They were no longer Saxon peasants surviving the cold. They were two combatants, fighting a silent war for the continuance of their bloodline against the utter brutality of the age. The house shuddered again, but this time the tremor came not from the wind, but from a precise, calculated impact on the far side of the foundation.
The enemy had moved, silently, cunningly, targeting the weakest structural point they had missed before, the timber sleeper beam, resting directly on the frozen ground beneath the frost line, where the ice would transmit sound and shock perfectly. The final countdown had begun, and the world outside was closing in to claim them.
The shudder that ripped through the earth was instantly translated into a violent, sickening crack that splintered the very air inside the main room. Alaric instinctively threw his body over the children, shielding them from the potential rain of frozen clay and straw that formed the flimsy walls of their sanctuary. This was not the rumble of distant war. This was the hammer blow of immediate, crushing reality, landing right on their doorstep, or perhaps directly on their supporting posts.
The entire east-facing wall, the one most exposed to the gale and the most brittle from the sustained deep freeze, seemed to inhale sharply, the dried mud matrix protesting its existence against a force that defied simple winter wind. Gisela screamed, a sound swallowed instantly by the roaring cacophony now emanating from the outside world, a sound that was both a terrifying growl and the metallic scraping of something heavy being dragged across the ice.
Alaric knew the terrifying truth of their home. It was a Fachwerkhaus, a marvel of medieval engineering, designed for speed and resource efficiency, not siege defense. The vertical posts, Ständer, were the only things bearing the massive weight of the roof thatch and the upper story, and those posts were anchored only by being sunk into shallow holes, resting directly on the frozen ground beneath the frost line, where the ice would transmit sound and shock perfectly. The final countdown had begun, and the world outside was closing in to claim them. He could feel the fine dust of the wattle and daub mixture, clay, sand, and animal dung, raining down onto his hair, a grim confetti marking the structural failure of their last defense.
He scrambled, pulling his small axe from beneath the straw bedding. His breath plumed white, even inches from the central hearth fire,
a testament to the sudden, catastrophic drop in internal temperature caused by the vibrations shaking the structure loose. He barked orders to Gisela, his voice strained and raw. "The fire! Dampen it, now!"
The last thing they needed was for a spark to catch the dry reed roof thatch if the timber frame buckled entirely. Fire was life, but tonight, fire was also an instantaneous death sentence, turning their frail shelter into a roaring pyre, visible for miles across the desolate Saxon plain. Gisela, moving with the terrifying efficiency of a mother protecting her young, began shoveling wet ash from the edges of the hearth onto the sputtering flames, desperately trying to reduce the blaze to smoldering embers without extinguishing the precious heat entirely. Then came the definitive impact. Not a test, but a blow. Crack, a sound like the shattering of 1,000 frozen bones, originating near the corner post closest to the forest edge. A gaping, jagged fissure instantly appeared in the clay infill, running vertically from the sill beam almost to the tie beam, exposing the woven hazel branches beneath. Through that sudden, shocking wound in the wall, a jet of super-chilled, lethal air blasted into the room, carrying with it the stench of pine sap, wet fur, and something rank, something distinctly predatory.
Alaric didn't hesitate. He knew that corner post was the keystone holding the entire frame rigid against lateral wind forces. If it went, the roof would likely follow. He shoved a heavy, crudely carved chest, their only storage unit, against the wall, trying to bridge the gap and provide temporary structural support. A futile gesture against true destructive force.
But the threat was not merely trying to break the wall, it was trying to see. A dark, massive shape pressed against the newly formed crack. The timber frame was flexing, groaning like a dying beast under the pressure. Alaric pressed his eye against the crack, knowing the foolish risk, desperate to identify the horror that had tracked them across the frozen wastes. He saw only a terrifying kaleidoscope of shadow and movement. Thick, coarse fur, the color of night. Immense musculature straining against the house. And then, most horrifyingly, the brief, blazing reflection of moonlight on an eye. Not the dull, frightened gaze of a deer or a wolf, but something intelligent, something focused, cold, and utterly devoid of pity. It was too low to the ground for a man standing upright, yet too massive for any known forest predator. The sound of wood splintering pulled his attention to the door. The main entry, constructed of heavy oak planks, but secured only by a thick crossbar dropped into iron staples. It was the next logical target. They had secured the door against thieves and small animals, not against something that treated the entire structure like a child's toy. The crossbar began to sing, vibrating wildly under repeated, rhythmic blows from the outside. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Each strike sent tremors through the entire floorboards, which were merely split logs laid across the joists, not tightly fitted planks. The heavy oak door itself was flexing inward, the wood screaming under the strain. Alaric realized the terrifying reality of their situation, a reality that medieval life constantly enforced. The world outside did not respect the domestic space. The lines between civilization and savagery were drawn in thin, fragile timber and clay. He had to reinforce the door. There was nothing heavy enough nearby, the small wooden bench and stool being useless. He looked desperately at Gisela, who was still managing the fire, her eyes wide with primal terror, but her movements precise. "The grindstone," he roared, pointing to the massive, heavy stone used for sharpening tools, usually kept near the entrance. "Roll it! Now!" It was an absurd task for a woman already exhausted and terrified, but survival demanded the impossible. Gisela didn't argue. With a guttural cry of effort, she began to strain against the massive stone wheel. It was cold, heavy, and unforgiving, but slowly, agonizingly, it began to move across the earthen floor, scraping and grinding, drawing closer to the threatened entrance. Meanwhile, Alaric wedged his shoulder against the straining oak, trying to absorb the shock of the external blows that threatened to shatter the iron staples holding the crossbar. He could smell the cold air rushing through the widening gaps around the doorframe. The creature outside, whether man or beast, was growing impatient. The rhythm of the blows accelerated, becoming a frantic, thunderous drumbeat of impending doom. The iron staples groaned, protesting the lateral force. The crossbar began to bend slightly at its center point. If the iron failed, or the brittle wood around the staples gave way, the door would fly inward, and the night would swallow them whole. Their flimsy, beloved timber cage was holding its breath, waiting for the final, fatal push that would unleash the Saxon winter and the horrifying predator it carried directly into the heart of their home. The grindstone was only halfway there, and the door was seconds from explosion.